I want to start with this image by earth artist, land artist Robert Simonson, because I think it does a better job than myself summarizing my main point today, which is about thinking through soil as a politically, culturally, ideologically charged matter capable of circulating knowledge of crops. This is an installation part of a series called Non-Site by American artist Robert Simonson, as I told. A pile of soil extracted in 1969 from a site in Germany now sits on a floor in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The contextualized pile of soil, or rather the non-site, as the artist calls it, does not operate as a dialectical opposite or a poorly crafted replication so much as a contested extension of the site. The non-site is a material artifact that circulates the knowledge of soil as well as knowledge of crops. Now that soil was extracted from its ground and multiplied through several pieces of mirrors into various reflections, it not only represents a nature that aspires to be at once infinite, fertile, and universal, but also brings to the fore a critical question. How do certain representations historicize and thereby reproduce nature? And how can we make sense of and learn from mirrored trajectories of nature when those trajectories do not quite resemble each other, but instead reflect uncannily distorted versions of one another? What happens when nature is lost, whereas its mirror images have taken a life of their own and kept multiplying in ways largely unpredictable? In light of these questions, I drew on 4 years of research revolving around the entangled histories of nature and space in Cold War Turkey. In this talk, by analyzing soil maps, field manuals, and aerial photos compiled in a specific form of scientific representation, namely survey reports, that boring material, I will address how and why soil traveled between sites and non-sites in a transitional moment whereby European colonial imaginaries of nature gave way to American technical assistance paradigm. In particular, I trace a shift from Dutch to American expertise by looking at failed experiments of sugarcane cultivation in southern Turkey, a little bit western portion of what Eray earlier showed us, regional-wise. Considering Smithson's thought-provoking statement that nature is never finished, I attempt to describe the emergence of an experimental nature, one never finished, yet torn between extreme fantasies inherent in the high modernist experience. Experimental nature is not one monolithic construction, but many. It consists of diverse sites that are connected to one another through unexpected yet inevitable circulation of scientific surveys, objects, and artifacts. The site that I focus on is this little corner of the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean basin called Çukurova, meaning hollow plain, where cotton production had reached its apex by the mid-20th century. An alluvial landform emerged out of three major river systems, which for centuries drained watersheds from the Taurus Mountains into the Mediterranean. Çukurova became means, evidence, and witness to a series of agricultural experiments in conjunction with the reconstruction of a mirror image, Nile Delta, as I will discuss in a minute. But first, in order to give a sense of place, I would like to take you to a photographic journey I conducted in the summer of 2015 in this site. Our starting point is this Greco-Roman place, Pompeiipolis, named after its conqueror Pompey the Great, who rebuilt this port city around 67 BC. Sitting side by side with contemporary forms of urbanization among privately owned gardens of citrus, this place tells us that long before its transformation into an agroeconomic testing ground, Çukurova was a battleground, like many other places, for various forms of sovereignties, including the Kingdom of Armenia and the Roman Republic. A 12-mile ride to the east of Pompeiipolis allows for making a big temporal jump and coming closer to the time period I am concerned with in my project. At this urban-rural fringe, you see on the left concrete structures that belong to the former oil refinery founded in 1958 based on an agreement between Turkish government and oil companies Mobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and Caltex. Adjacent to this toxic industrial zone takes place agricultural fields and gardens of small farmers and large landowners. This area actually is a center of citrus production and greenhouse vegetable and fruit cultivation right now. It is the homeland of Arab Alevite minority populations settled in the region 150 years ago for agricultural purposes. Seasonal migrant labor is integral to the making of this landscape, and it has traditionally been consisted of Kurds and Arabs of Turkish nationality, but these groups, as you all know, have partly been replaced by the Syrian migrant workforce since the beginning of the war in 2011. Driving east into the heart of Çukurova, into the heart of this agricultural plain, takes us to temporary tent settlements of seasonal migrant workers. They are paid daily basis, or in some cases, instead of paying, landowners solely provide food and shelter in exchange for labor. Exploiting the docile workforce emerging out of the clash between newly arrived Syrians and former Kurdish and Arab populations, landowners reinvent forms of unfree labor through various mechanisms of debt and bondage. Across plain, from south to north, one could feel the transition from coastal lagoons, which have blurred the boundaries between the land and the sea, to dunes, piles of dunes once again inhabited by workers' settlements. In the stillness and everydayness of these piles of dunes lies sedimented narratives of land, labor, and capital. Therefore, I will end this photographic journey here at the heart of the plain, as the image demands a close historical reading. In the rest of my talk, I will trace another story unfolding in the past, one that allows seeing this landscape as emerged out of the hybrid of colonial botany and soil science. Not exactly at this particular angle where I stand while taking these two photographs, but perhaps within a very close proximity to this location. 70 years ago, in February 1945, Dutch soil scientist Willem van Liere was conducting a tedious fieldwork to survey and map the soils of Çukurova. Van Liere's survey was an example of the modern field of soil science, which had been developed, improved, and tested extensively across Dutch colonies and brought back to the metropolis by the end of World War II. Van Liere compiled not only his findings, but also visual documentation of mapping techniques and processes into his survey report. Thus, I analyzed this archival object not simply as a document revealing certain facts on natural and cultural conditions of soil about my field site, but rather as an extension of a peculiar kind of scientific practice that I call the fabrication of a global experimental nature. According to the scientist, soil surveys were a means to translate the agricultural experience of a particular locale to make it relevant in other locations with the same or similar soil types. With a group of locals, now I'm doing what Donna Haraway inspired, like I want to stay with the scientist's narrative, or in the way Bruno Latour describes how science in the making through the site, I will describe what he was doing. With a group of locals, including peasants and agricultural engineers, by digging holes across the field site, looking through soil horizons, collecting samples, and making them analyzed at the soil laboratories of Groningen and Wageningen, Van Liere reported that the soils of Çukurova, Turkey, were in large part composed of anthropogenic soils, meaning they were the outcome of centuries of intense agriculture and urbanization dating back to the Roman period. And finally, exploring the entire field as an archaeological landscape rather than simply alluvial sediment by juxtaposing in situ data collection with aerial photos and prehistoric objects like this grain pot collected from the site, the scientist was ready to read every inch of soil's memory through his experimental ground in this particular site. All these efforts were part of a broader research agenda, actually, that the Turkish government had inaugurated in 1939, right before the war, for an inquiry into the prospects of a cane sugar industry in Turkey. Head of the research team was sugar technologist Cornelis van Dillewijn, the former director of the Cherabon Research Station in the Netherlands East Indies. While Van Liere was extremely busy with writing a soil memoir, as I have demonstrated right before this slide, Van Dillewijn was in charge of historicizing the life of sugarcane in the larger geohistorical context of the Mediterranean. By looking at the picturesque landscape covered with 3 to 4 meter long flowered stems of a tropical grass, namely Saccharum spontaneum, wild cane, Van Dillewijn noted that he was onto a significant finding in taxonomical terms, as, quote, Turkey could now be added to the long list of places where wild cane had been discovered, including, quote, the island of Formosa, the Dutch Indies, and British India, end quote. During his fieldwork, Van Dillewijn also discovered that farmers in Çukurova surprisingly were already cultivating some varieties of sugarcane. He identified that these crop varieties were of a specific kind here, POJ, the specific name of the crop type, originated from Dutch Java, but he had thought that these crops would probably be imported from Egypt to Turkey. Therefore, he traveled to Nile Delta to find out how, why, and when crop samples were exchanged between Turkey and Egypt. These two reports came out of his comparative analysis of the relations between soil, climate, land, and labor conditions at these two Mediterranean sites. The need to mirror or compare different agricultural fields in this particular context had in part to do with colonial scientific aspirations to know and archive local ecological specificities of variegated sites. The scientist further noted that, quote, it's a curious fact in cane sugar industry that in general more attention is paid to factory than to field methods. The cardinal point of industry, however, lies without doubt in the field. It's often forgotten that sugar is produced in the field, but only extracted in the factory. Consequently, the field offers the greatest possibilities of improving the earning capacity of the industry. In the factory, the processes are to a great degree under control. In the field, however, one has to do with living plants growing under ever-changing conditions of soil and climate. End quote. Meaning that the field, or rather in a broader scale, the local had to be historically and climatologically reconstructed so that landscapes could turn into factories. In this case, to industrial plantations. Named after Cuban chemist and agronomist Álvaro Reynoso, one distinctive technique among others was at the core of Dutch science of sugarcane, Reynoso system. Right before Cuban Wars of Independence and eventual abolition of slavery in 1886, Álvaro Reynoso hoped to develop a solution to the problem of soil exhaustion on the island due to previous centuries' immensely mechanized cane production in the hands of Spanish colonizers. Interestingly enough, however, Reynoso's system did not take root in Cuba at all, but the translation of Reynoso's article on his field methods into Dutch was greatly appreciated by Dutch scientific community. Reynoso's system required intense amount of manual labor since preparing the land into ditches and irrigation canals needed to be done mostly by hand instead of machines. It was a labor-intensive system which worked neatly for landscapes of Dutch Java or the Nile Delta, where there was not an issue of labor shortage at the time. These survey photos compared the ways in which Reynoso's system could operate at two climatologically similar locations with completely different conditions of land rent and cost of labor. Here, the visuality of female labor in Çukurova, Turkey, should be noted, which is not quite clear from the imagery of Nile Delta. What is way clearer, however, which is not visible in Çukurova, is that child labor was prevalent in the Nile plantations as seen in harvest imagery like this one, where we see one of the most laborsome activities during harvest, that is the peeling of cane stalks and their cutting into appropriate industrial size before going to factory. Based on this in-depth comparative research between Turkey and Egypt, a regional sugar research station was built in Turkey. Several other scientists were recruited from Netherlands to script possible scenarios for hypothetical industrialized manufacture and to design tightly connected relations between the plantation, the factory, and the market. Accordingly, an experimental irrigation network was implemented and new crop samples were imported from Java, Louisiana, and India. All in all, scientists' nature was ready to yield commodities, albeit at the experimental scale. The next step would be to expand the scale of cultivation to plantations similar to those observed in Egypt and to establish the first factory by the end of 1948. And yet, that next step was never taken. Because 1948 marked the rule of American technical assistance paradigm. Immediately after Dutch scientists left the country, the Turkish government invited American experts to the field. One of these experts was agronomist Leo Hebert, who was then working at the US sugar plant field station in Houma, Louisiana. Spending a month in southern Turkey in 1952 and focusing on self-evident similarities between the alluvial soils of two settings, Çukurova and southern Louisiana, Hebert prepared a final report. This report focused on considerable problems, especially regarding the fundamental issue of guaranteeing access to land and labor. Sugar plantations were a unique outcome of cheap land and labor. In other words, the exploitation of so-called discovered landscapes and predominantly unfree labor. But neither land was cheap nor labor power was perpetual in Çukurova. Large landowners dominated most fertile soils at the region, leading cash crop was cotton, and landowners were completely against selling their lands to the state-owned sugar factories. Nor were they willing to alternate cotton with sugarcane. Hebert also noted that in the absence of a market analysis on the price relations and competitiveness between cotton and sugarcane, it will be too risky to introduce an extremely labor-intensive crop like sugarcane. Claims made by high-ranking Turkish technocrats were particularly revealing in that the politically charged term plantation became instrumental to legitimize their own reluctance and interests in not investing in sugarcane. For instance, a critical statement made by one of those officials read, quote, "It seems doubtful whether sugarcane can settle and survive among other crops in an intensive agriculture region like Çukurova, since cane cultivation has been a matter of tropical economics and required lower standards of living in terms of agricultural labor. We are concerned that it is difficult for this crop, which demands a colonial labor regime, to find essential economic circumstances in our country that is determined to reach higher standards of living," end quote. Of course, the reasoning behind this ironic statement, considering the earlier imagery I showed you about the conditions of agricultural labor in the region, had to do with the lack of cheap and consistent supply of labor. Çukurova was and has been a center of mobile, temporary, or migrant labor exploited by cotton farming and manufacturing from the 1950s to the 1990s and by citrus farming and vegetable production today. So as a result of these discussions that centered around Hebert's final report, Çukurova Sugar Research Station was shut down, cane varieties and related technological artifacts were transferred to the Ministry of Agriculture from the Ministry of State Enterprises as historical relics representing the 1930s statist and protectionist model of industrialization. The fields of sugarcane experimentation were sold to large landowners who had cotton estates at the region. By alluding to the so-called failure of sugarcane experiments, American Agricultural Advisory Group in Turkey reported that, quote, "The wide gap which now exists between agricultural educational institutions, departmental experiment stations, and the practical farmer must be closed. Pure science has its place, but applied science is the crying need just now. Coats must come off, white collars be laid aside, and ditches dug from the reservoirs of knowledge to the fields of the farm until the nation, including the farmers, have attained a much higher standard of living." End quote. Conceptually, the anticipated shift from pure science to applied science referred to the extension of an already standardized knowledge to the locale, unlike Dutch scientists' efforts to reconstruct every other site in tandem with the extraction of various local knowledges from same or similar climatic environments. In other words, the ways in which American agricultural experts differentiated applied science from pure science illustrated a highly nuanced understanding of developmentalism compared to its Dutch precedent at this particular instance. Dutch colonial idealism and related scientific commitment to local ecological specificities gave way to American pragmatism. This is not to say that experimental nature was interrupted. On the contrary, agricultural experiments continued in full speed. For instance, in order to reconstruct the category of cultivable land in Turkey from 1952 to 54, US mission conducted a comprehensive soil survey and prepared a national soil map, namely the soils of Turkey. This survey was built on the knowledge of former studies like those conducted in Çukurova, yet the spatial scale of inquiry shifted from the local to the national in an attempt to naturalize national territory as a scientific unit of analysis. This scalar shift, in fact, had to do with an emerging global concern regarding how to categorize soil as a natural resource for a world-scale land speculation. In this context, the soil map signified the latest phase of imperialist conceptions of discovery and conquest, not only of what was seen as less civilized through the lens of Euro-American perspective, but also of the earth in broader terms. To summarize, central to the processes of global capitalist state formation was the discovery of a new nature, one that existed insofar as it was inscribed on textual, visual, and technical records of global environmental knowledge, such as soil maps, crop samples, and field models. Tracing these objects' unexpected but inevitable circulation, with a particular focus on their situatedness in certain regional histories, I have tried to demonstrate an example of the long dialectic between science and capital, which has continually shaped colonial and neo-colonial geographies of cash crop farming. Formulating and securing an experimental nature through standardized forms of scientific representation was vital to the politics and ethics of international developmentalism. Nonetheless, landscapes that emerged out of the seemingly totalizing experiment were by no means identical everywhere on Earth, for the locality persisted in its own ever-changing, precarious conditions of labor. Thank you.